Hi, my name is Steve Bishop. I'm a golf instructor out at Rio Salado Golf Course, and today we're going to be taking a look at Gereth's swing using the 5-step program. And as Gereth may not know, the first step is to take a look at the equipment of the golf swing. And obviously, since I haven't actually met you, Gereth, and I haven't had the ability to actually take a look at your golf clubs, I'm just going to basically go off of what I see on video. It's not going to be very exact, but it's a couple things that I can notice about your equipment that I might be able to point out for you. The loft looks pretty good on the club, which is part of my 6Ls, I should mention. The 6Ls that I generally look for when fitting golf equipment are loft, lie angle, length of the club, loading of the shaft, the lightness of the club, and of course the looks of the club. As for loft, really the only way that I can tell whether or not there's an appropriate amount of loft on the club is to see if there's any manipulation that you have to the club, like if you're trying to flip at it or try to get the ball up in the air, if it looks like you're basically trying to lift the ball up in the air or increase the loft during your golf swing. That's usually an indication that there's not enough loft on the golf club. It's a lot easier to see with your driver than it is with your irons. But anyway, I'll just progress through the golf swing here, and I'll tell you that especially by the time that we get to impact, we can see that you're not really trying to lift the club at all. It just looks like you're making a pretty good strong pass, releasing kind of low towards the target rather than trying to pick it up. Normally we would see people's hands kind of going up more this direction rather than basically out this direction, and you can see the club is moving on a path basically in that direction as well. Which is good. So you're fine with the loft, it looks like. Obviously with the lie angle, which is the second part of my 6Ls, I can't really tell based on the video. But generally the lie angle also goes with the length of the shaft and the length of the club, which really can help determine part of your posture. And what I see here is that the length of your club looks pretty good because you're not standing too erect, you're not standing too short. It doesn't look like you're compensating for the length of the club at all. You look to be in pretty good position with your arms hanging down pretty good, just out in front of you. You're not crowding the club, you're not really stretching it out, you're not standing too tall or too short or bending over or anything like that. So I'd say that the length of your club is pretty good. Now, the one thing that's very, very obvious to me, though, is the loading of the shaft. I would say your clubs, at least this particular club, is not loading at all during your golf swing. And we can really tell because this is during your transition point right here, and there is a straight line from your hands to the club head at this point. In other words, there is no flex to this shaft at all. That would be a clear indication that you are not getting any loading of that shaft at all. And we can even see as we progress through your swing, we can just draw straight lines from your hands to the club head all the way through, even past impact. It's just a straight rod going from your hands to the club head. And this means that there's some timing and some feel that you're losing. You can't, one of the best ways to put it is you cannot feel this club head at all, and I'm sure it's probably causing you struggles with knowing exactly when the club face is squaring up, because there's no flexing of the shaft that's giving you feedback to your hands, so you don't have any idea exactly what that club head is doing. All you could feel is just swinging a stiff rod. Now the lightness of the club looks fairly good. Obviously it might even be a little too light because the club isn't flexing. But you definitely aren't, it's not too heavy, you're not having to pick up the club. It doesn't look like you're kind of like leaning forward in order to lift the club like you might see with a junior more likely. And then also on the finish, it doesn't look like you're really tugging during the forward swing. It doesn't look like you're pulling really hard in order to make it happen. It looks like you're releasing pretty well. And then of course the last of my 6Ls is the looks of the club, which is something that's aesthetically, is it appealing to you? Obviously I can't tell that for you. I can't make that determination. That's something you have to know for yourself. But And we'll move on to step 2. And the first thing that I like to look at for step 2 is the grip. Now initially I thought that your grip was a little bit strong, and maybe it is a little tiny bit, but not enough that I would say that you really need to make any dramatic changes to it. Basically I see that the back of your left hand is facing the sky a little bit, but this also, you can see that your left arm is kind of bending in a little bit to create that little upward look to it. If you had more of a straight angle between your shoulder to the club head, I don't think that we'd be seeing the back of that left hand facing the sky as much. The real indication of it, though, is when I took a look at it from the down the line view up at the top of your backswing, this is what really indicated to me that you were okay. Because when we look at the club face and the back of your left hand, we can see just a small amount of cupping of your left wrist, which is not too bad. It does indicate perhaps that maybe your thumb of your left hand is right directly on top of the shaft, whereas I prefer it off to the side, to the right a little bit. And that might be the reason why you're cupping it here. But when you look at the club face and you compare it to the angle of the back of your hand, they're just about in line with each other. I think you're just fine. Maybe just, again, like a little bit strong, but not bad. Once you were to flatten this out, I think we'd see this club face would be a little bit more at an angle like this, which is directly parallel with your forearm. So I think your grip is pretty neutral. It's just that you're a little cupped at the top. And again, you set up at the beginning with that left forearm bent a little bit, which gives the appearance that it's a little strong. But in fact, I think you're very neutral. You just maybe have, again, that placement of that left thumb is a little bit on top of the shaft, whereas I prefer it onto the side, which will eliminate this cupping. Let's go back to the setup here again, and we'll take a look at your stance. The width of your stance looks pretty good. It looks pretty good for, I believe this is probably about a 4 or 5 iron, I think. And I think that's pretty good. Your ball position is right up, just off the instep of your front foot, which is great. Right off of your left kneecap, which is fine. You do look to be a bit back on your heels when we take a look at the down the line view. And this is going to become important later on, and I'll just show you what I mean by this and how we can tell. If I draw a line straight back from where your hind end is, and then I draw a straight line from where your shoulders are, this gives us an indication of about where your balance is, because your balance would be somewhere right about in the middle. And as you can see, the distance from your heel to this line is greater than from the toe to that line. So that's an indication that there's much more space between where your hind end is, and it's back further away from your heels than your shoulders are over your toes. So your weight is definitely proportionally more on the heels than it is on your toes at the setup. I ideally like to have more weight directly over the middle of your foot, which would place you a little bit more forward. You can see the distance here. Again, you have more of your hind end back here from where middle would be, and more not enough front end in front of your arches in order to be properly balanced. You have pretty good knee flex. I wouldn't say that there's anything that needs to be done here. You have pretty good flexing of your knees. Just barely unlocked, just enough to keep your balance, and move around. Like I said, again, you're just basically leaning back a little bit too much. I don't think there's anything wrong with your posture. It's just, back on your heels a little bit with your weight. One thing is your axis tilt. When we take a look at the face-on view, if I draw a line straight from where you're right in the middle to up your neck, we see that in fact this line is aimed a little bit forward with your upper body, right? And your lower body is back this way a little bit. It's almost straight up and down, but it's actually even more in the reverse position. Ideally, we should see a little bit more angle back this direction, so that your upper body is going backwards, right, while your lower body is going forwards. So I would strongly suggest that you get maybe a little bit more of your front hip a little bit more over your toe. I wouldn't say that needs to happen quite as much as we just need to get this back shoulder basically over your foot over here. Right now you're just a little bit leaning too far forward with your upper body. I'd like to see it leaning back just a little bit so that we have a little bit more of an angle like this at your setup. Just going back to the down the line view, I just want to point out something. There's just a little bit of arch to your back here. It's not so bad that I'm going to say you absolutely have to fix it, but you might want to think about sticking your chest out a little bit. So you stick your chest out towards the ball just a little bit, just to kind of give your shoulders a little bit more room to rotate and free them up for a good turn. And then the last thing we're just going to mention here is your arms and how they definitely look great as far as their distance away from your body. I think because of this distance of where your arms are away from your body, I think if you were to actually lean more towards your toes, you'd run into a problem where your arms would start to crowd your body a little bit. So in fact, instead of shifting your weight towards your toes, what I'm going to suggest you do is stand just a hair bit further away from the ball. Get your feet back maybe just a couple of inches further away from the ball than where you currently are. Moving on to step 3, which may seem a little weird because most people like to go to learn things in a linear direction. I'm not going to talk about your takeaway or your backswing or anything like that. What I'm going to talk about is your finish. And on your finish, I think it can really help identify what went on during the golf swing. And based upon what I see on your front foot, you look rolled to the outside of your heel. And that indicates the left hip pulled away from the ball during the swing instead of just reestablishing its position and letting the right hip move forward. Now this pull will have a slight domino effect on the rest of your body, and it's going to change your swing plane. And we'll get to that just a little bit later. But in the down the line view, you can see your placement. In the down the line view, you can see the placement of your hips puts a bit more weight on that heel of that front foot rather than directly over the arch of your front foot. And you see, like if I were to try to draw it straight down the middle, you're going to see that your balance is right over that heel, as opposed to where I'd prefer to see it, which would be more or less right over the arch of your foot, right there. So that means that you're going to have to find a way to prevent from basically pulling this left hip this direction during your golf swing. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. Taking a look at your knees, your back knee definitely reaches your front knee, which is good. It means you've gotten all of your weight transferred to the front foot. Indicates a full swing. You've moved all the way through this shot, trying to get as much of your right side into this swing as you possibly can, which obviously is the direction where you can add a lot of power. It does make you a bit of a hitter because you are making such a strong pass at it with your right side. In the down the line view, again, I just want to point out that that knee, just like your hip, has moved inside so that your right knee is basically right over your arch, while your left knee is again back over your heel, which puts it right smack dab in the middle right there. Again, so that puts your weight on your heel, which is just something we can tell by taking a look at the knees. Again, I would rather have this right knee just a little bit more out over here, so that we'll put you there in the middle. Gosh, look at all those green lines. We already went over your hips, but let's go ahead and take a look at your shoulders. And one thing I really like about your swing is this right here. Your right shoulder is lower than your left on the finish, which is fantastic. It indicates a good movement of the right shoulder down towards the ball instead of up and out of the swing. Generally with a slicer of the golf ball or someone who has a problem hitting it square, you're going to see this right shoulder is more or less above the left shoulder. And that indicates they pulled out of the swing and they're trying to pull across their body. which you do a good job of releasing the club much more down towards the target, which is why you're allowed to keep that right shoulder down playing a little bit more. Taking a look at your elbows, we can see that the left elbow has pulled away from the right elbow. You see this right elbow over here, and the left elbow is kind of pulled away from it. Here is probably better view if we take a look at the face-on view. And you can see how this left elbow is pointing a little bit more behind you, and the right elbow is out in front. I don't think that this separation is quite as bad as it could be, mostly because your elbows are both pointing towards the ground. If we take a look here at the down the line view again, you can see that your elbows, both of them, your right elbow is pointing out towards the target a little bit, but it's still out in front of you, while your left elbow is pointing down towards the ground. And that's important. If it was pointing more in the direction of this, this area back here behind you, this direction, that would be bad. That would be a really bad thing. But instead you have it pointing more direct, more towards the ground here, which is good. That indicates a pretty strong release. There is, like I said, a little bit of separation. I think that has more to do with your right arm trying to be very active in this swing to try to release hard. But I think in general your elbow position isn't all that bad, and you don't really need to make too much of a change to it. I would suggest maybe just a little bit more of keeping this elbow out in front of you, because it's kind of just a little bit at an angle this way. I prefer to see it pointing and being a little bit more out in front of your chest, as opposed to back behind you, which we can really see again in the face view. This elbow is back behind you as opposed to being out here in front of you, which is where I prefer to see it. But it's not a dramatically important thing to change. I think this is more of a reaction to your swing and where the ball's going, rather than something that you're really struggling with. Taking a look at your hands, they look like they're fully hinged. They're placed right over your shoulder, so you're not pulling away from it, you're not pulling across it. There's no indication of a poor wrist action at all. The club is finishing a little horizontal compared to the swing plane, and what I mean by that is it's pointing out here a little bit, and the ball was down here, so it does mean that you pulled off of the swing plane just a little bit to finish that shot, which is pretty normal, especially when you're standing up a little bit taller on the finish, but it does indicate that you have, at the finish, you're kind of holding the club and pulling it across you, not pulling it across you, but you're kind of manipulating it just a little bit at the very, very end of your swing and not allowing it to remain going on the swing plane. It's a very, very fine detail that doesn't really need to be considered too much. But if you were to try to make any sort of change, I just would like to see the club pointing down a little bit more towards where the ball was. Just indicates that you've stayed soft with your arms during the finish. Whereas here you've kind of stiffened up with your arms a little bit on the finish just to bring that club back up. That's not too unusual. Moving on to step 4, which is balance. We'll just again take a look at the setup again. And in the down the line view, like I said, I just wanted to reiterate, you're back on your heels a little bit here. Now, since your balance directly affects your swing plane, and you're set up with more weight on your heels, you'll have to do one of two things in order to hit the ball solidly from where you're starting. You will either have to pull away from the ball during your swing, or make some compensations during your swing to make up for a slightly cramped, more cramped position. So in other words, what I'm saying is you're either going to pull back away from the ball in that direction in order to keep your distance from the ball, or if you do manage to get more out over the ball, you're going to be a little bit more cramped, and you'd have to make some manipulations with your arms in order to strike the ball. What I see here is, in fact, that you make the first compensation, which is you just kind of stay away from the ball. You kind of pull away from it. And that's kind of why you finish with your weight on that heel, is because you start off on your heel and you finish on your heel, which means that you basically kept your weight on your heels during the entire swing. It's not, in my opinion, that's not as powerful as it could be. But you can see that, I mean, if we basically keep an eye on where your hind end is during this whole swing, we can see that it starts there, stays there, and it finishes there until the very, very end, where you finally get that left hip pulled in just a little bit. And this is pretty normal. I mean, there's a lot of guys that swing by doing this, by basically pulling their left hip out of the way. And I'm going to just show you here exactly what I mean by this. As you make your swing forward, I want you to pay particular attention to what your left hip is doing, because it's going to try, since you started out so far away from the ball with your hips, with your hind end, you're going to have to pull this left hip way back, off in this direction, back towards the wall, in order for you to maintain where that, basically what they call the tush line was, okay? So what you're going to see is while you swing, you're going to pull that left hip back. You see that? You see that move right there? Where you pull the left hip back. I'll just kind of go back and forth in this frame so you can see it yourself. As you pull away from the ball. You see this? Right there, you're pulling away from the ball. Okay? And we'll show it in the down the line view. Watch your left hip, it pulls away. You see this? As opposed to what I like to see is a reestablishment, and this is just kind of more of a matter of preference, but to me it's one of the reasons why you pull across the shot a little bit, is because your left hip is pulling your swing plane from outside to in a little bit. So even with a good shoulder rotation where the right shoulder is going down, because your lower body is pulling across, your lower body is pulling this way, your right shoulder is trying to go down this way, it adds quite a bit of torque to it, but it's pulling your arms and your hands across the shot. You see how from here to here, you're kind of pulling across and in from outside to in, just a little bit. Not bad, but just a little bit to make your shot a little bit errant. And that combined with your strong release is going to produce a little bit of a pull shot. Okay, we're not talking about a huge one, but a little bit. And I think that's probably what you're trying to get rid of, is just that slight pull across with a good strong release is going to create that straight pull dead left. Okay, and it's not too bad, maybe 10 yards, 15 yards at the most of a pull, but it has to do with this left hip getting so far back behind you. And just so you can see, you're already starting to roll that foot out at that point. And I'll just show you on this follow through. You can see how that front foot is rolling to try to compensate for where that left hip went, because your weight is back on your heels at this point. The proper move that I prefer to see is if you were to set up with a little bit more weight on your arches, you're going to be able to move your right hip and your right knee more towards this sign out here, out in this direction. Okay, as it is, basically, if we were to imagine where your pivot point would be, I like to have the pivot point of your hips. So at this point here, by this time here, you should reestablish that this is where your left hip is going to be. And now your right hip should be moving to pass it. Okay, so establishment of the left hip, and then the right hip and the right knee work towards the target, or actually out like more towards first base of the target, then having your left hip still trying to pull away. This is the bad thing. You're still having, instead of establishing where that left hip is and then letting the right hip move past it, you in fact are still pulling that left hip away. And we'll just, again, I just want to point out, see, this left hip is pulling away. So instead of having this knee bending and moving towards the target more, and having this left hip really moving out towards the right side, more towards the ball, you're having it move more towards your heel. And again, we'll just point out in the down the line view, you can see that your right hip and your right knee are moving more off this direction than this direction. And that's an indication that your left hip is pulling this way which is causing your right hip to not be able to move that direction, because they're two opposing directions, obviously. If your left hip is going this way, your right hip has no choice but to go with it. I hope that's a good enough explanation of what I'm talking about, and perhaps you might want to see the video where I discuss the hip action in order to get a better indication of what I'm talking about. Now the final step for you to take a look at here, Gereth, is the relaxation. Your backswing looks nice and relaxed. I don't see any particularly contrived motion going back. On the beginning of your forward swing, it looks like you're moving pretty steeply down to the ball, and then making a hard roll of your forearms just at impact. So you may have a sense of tension somewhere just before and at impact. Like right about here you probably feel some tension, and then right here you probably feel some more tension, a little bit more. And this basically makes you a bit of a hitter rather than a swinger. This timing of tension and release of tension will be critical to your ability to hit solid shots. As a result, your tempo will be good in the backswing, but a bit hurried on the forward swing. It's not as free-flowing as a motion as it could be. If you ease off with your arm strength in the forward swing, and instead rely on a better hip action, I think this, to help put that club on plane and keep it on plane, I believe you'll have a smoother tempo, better relaxation, and you'll just basically hit some more pure shots with your power all being directed on plane instead of being directed toward closing the club face. Because basically you only have so much energy, and right now your energy is not driving on plane, it's driving to manipulate the club face and trying to roll it closed just to catch the club face up with your arms. And you do a pretty good job of that. That's, as we can see by your release. And honestly, you can be a really good player from where you're at, because you have a good amount of tilt by the time you reach the ball, and you release the club very strongly. With those two things, anybody can be a player with a good axis tilt and a good release. If you can teach anybody to do those two things, you can teach anybody to do anything, and they'll play great golf from that position. But we're looking at an overall look of your golf swing, and to me, I would like to see you get a little bit more relaxed in order to get to this position. And again, that relies on a better hip action and a softening up of your arms and letting the club face kind of close on its own, because you're swinging it on plane rather than trying to make up for the slight pull across by rotating your forearms to get the club face to catch up with it. I don't really have anything else for you at this time, Gereth. If you feel like submitting your video to me again, I'll be happy to do any follow-up looks for you. If I was just to reiterate a couple things that I think that you really need to do in order to improve your golf swing, I'd say at the setup, you need to get a little bit more axis tilt, set up a little bit further away from the ball so that you can get more weight towards your toes. Should be right over your arches is where I believe you should be. You definitely need to get some more flexible shafts in those clubs. If you're going to keep that club head, maybe even get a little bit of a heavier club head to make those shafts flex, or you need to change the shaft flex to match the club head so that it does flex. But obviously this straight rod thing is going to be causing you some problems. And then of course, like I said, the hip action. Instead of trying to pull the left hip away, I would rather see you trying to push the right hip forward and drive it more towards the target, or a little bit right of the target during your swing, just with a re-established left hip, and then pushing the right hip forward. And then of course, like I said, the relaxation of the arms. Rather than trying to push down and then roll hard, I would like to see a little bit more of a relaxed motion with your arms and keeping that club on plane and just letting the club face square itself.